for 37 years. And I don't remember a time where we've had a situation like this where we had our mayor helping us understand how best to legislate, how best to understand how laws and legislation is moved along. And this is just an outstanding opportunity, for us to better educate, our community on those issues. So from the educational arm of Community Alliance for Better Government, this is where we are now. Diane Goldring and Mayor Biss, they connected and said, hey, how can we help our citizens better understand the legislative process in city government? And Diane, I'm gonna send it over to you, and kind of how did you and Mayor Daniel Biss, how did y'all work through this? But recognizing tonight, that's the focus. That's what we're trying to do here tonight, is focus more on the educational side of it. How do we better understand the legislative issues of our city government? So Diane.
Thanks, Rick. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, how it all started was, you may or may not know, people here may or may not know, I ran for city council, and even I thought Evanston city government, or maybe because I ran for city council, I thought Evanston city government is confusing. If you've ever been to a meeting, lots of different terms are thrown around, and a lot of times it's hard to follow what's going on. Why is there no dialogue during public comment? And how does an item get on the agenda? And what is for action and for introduction? What do those terms mean? And what is a city manager form of government anyway? So I'm really thrilled that Evanston Mayor Daniel Biss is here to help sort it all out. You all probably know that prior to becoming Evanston's mayor, Daniel Biss served in the Illinois legislature from 2011 to 2019. Did I get that right? Yeah, ish, yes. You may not know that before entering politics, Mayor Biss was a math professor at the University of Chicago. So obviously he has quite a bit of experience explaining confusing and difficult topics. So I'm really especially excited to see so many new names and faces here, and people who I don't know or recognize. And I'm hoping that once everybody understands how Evanston city government works, we hope you remain active and engaged citizens. So with that, I will turn it over to Mayor Biss. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Diane. Thanks, Rick. Thanks to all of CABG. I'm not going to lie to you. When I think it was Diane first reached out and suggested that we do this, I was really excited and perplexed because I thought, who's going to want to hear a kind of a dry procedural lecture on municipal government? And I should not be surprised that I've clearly been proven wrong about that by the attendance tonight. And I just feel like this is a conversation that is important to have, because I don't think that I know that Diane's not the only person who finds the mechanisms of Evanston government confusing. And I know that because I find them confusing, which is a real bummer because I'm supposed to preside over the meetings. And for those of you who make the odd lifestyle choice of watching the meetings, you'll often see me sort of criticize myself or say, oops, there you go again, Daniel, because I'm still trying to get my head around all of it. And so I'm really thrilled that folks are interested in having this conversation, but I am mindful of the fact that it's a little bit dry. I mean, it's not, we're not talking about affordable housing or racial justice or the tax rate. We're talking about, legislative process. And so out of respect for that, I want this to be as kind of much back and forth as possible. As I understand it, the questions are going to come through the chat. And so I think I would recommend, and obviously it's not my meeting, but my recommendation would be if folks have questions, just drop them in the chat, and the moderators can decide when to interrupt and interject, and we can do that earlier or later depending on what folks' mood is. But I definitely want to do this in a way that keeps people interested and engaged. I mean, I wasn't kidding a minute ago when I said that I find this confusing. And I was, after I was elected mayor and before I took office, I went through this period where I would read the Evanston City Council rules, at least a couple times every week. And for those of you who haven't read them, they're available at the top of the Evanston City Council webpage. And they're like 30 sort of short pages long. So it's not the world's greatest time commitment, but I would find that when I got to the end, I was always a little more confused than I had been when I started, that I always felt like I was missing something, or maybe something wasn't there. And as I began to ask questions, a lot of the answers were kind of like, well, yeah, I know it seems a little ambiguous in the rule, but here's how we do it, or here's how we've always done it, or here's how it's worked sometimes. And you can have all sorts of different views about the wisdom of unwritten rules or the kind of power of tradition, but whether you like it or don't like it, if that's what's going on, it's really important for us to communicate about it so we can bring more people into the circle of those who understand how all that works. And I the other thing I wanted to do kind of starting off was just to give a kind of an analogy of the kind of information that I'm hoping we can talk about tonight from my days in Springfield. So if you, oh, thank you, Ali, that's awesome. If you go to the authoritative source on how bills become laws in state capitals or Washington, which is Schoolhouse Rock, it'll tell you that a bill has to get a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate and be signed by the governor. And then the majority in the House is 60, let's say. That's just what the math tells you. And so you might think that you know enough information at that point to understand how a bill becomes a law in Springfield. But of course, if you're trying to get a bill passed yourself, if you as an advocate are trying to shepherd something through the process, it's not enough to know that you have 60 House members who are willing to vote for it. You got to figure out what makes it come up for a vote. And the answer to that question in Springfield is, well, the person presiding over the House, which when I was there was Mike Madigan, got to decide. And then there was the question of, how did it get to that point? Well, it had to get out of a committee. How did it get to a committee? Well, the answer in effect was Mike Madigan got to decide. And so what you had in Springfield was a whole bunch of extremely precise rules that told you how many votes you needed and this and that and the other. And anytime there was something that was kind of not written out explicitly, the actual explanation was, well, Mike Madigan gets to decide. And so I thought that kind of stunk, but it was very, very clear what you had to do if you wanted to get your bill passed. You had to either convince the number of people on the committee or the number of people in the House to pass it, or you had to get Mike Madigan to go along with you. And so as an advocate, there was a relatively straightforward roadmap. So by comparison, in Evanston City Council, what's in the rules is pretty simple. There are basically two kinds of votes that occur: votes on ordinances or votes on everything else, and much of the everything else tends to be resolutions. The difference between an ordinance and a resolution is an ordinance amends the city codes. So there's like a book somewhere, or in practice, a digital book that is the city code, all of the accumulated law essentially of the city. And if you want to change that, you have to pass an ordinance. So if you want to put something in effect that is going to be on the books over time, that has to be done via ordinance. And so, for instance, if you want to create a new infraction that you want to be enforced not just today but forever, if you want to make it, illegal to cross the street while wearing a purple shirt or something, and declare that you have to be assessed a $50 fine if you're caught doing that, that's something that would have to be written into the city code and could only be done via ordinance. By contrast, a resolution is typically just kind of a decision to do something now, which is often ephemeral. So like a lot of the resolutions will say, for example, authorizing the city manager enter into a contract with a vendor to pave this particular street. And the point is, you pass the resolution, the city manager is authorized to enter into that contract, they enter into that contract, and then you don't have to worry about it anymore. So there's ordinances which amend the city code, and resolutions which are kind of everything else. And I'm talking about this now because procedurally they're very different. An ordinance needs to be voted on twice. The ordinance is introduced, it comes up for a vote for introduction, and if that vote passes, then it comes back again, typically at the next council meeting, for action. And so if you're kind of gaming out how fast can something happen, An ordinance would typically be slower than a resolution because it would require 2 different council meetings to come up. So then the question you might ask is, what makes something show up on a city council agenda? And that is actually, unlike everything else that we're probably going to talk about today, super straightforward. There are basically 2 ways that something appears on a city council agenda. Either it's passed out of a committee, or else it's placed on the agenda by a majority vote of city council or by me as what's called a special order of business. So if you want something to like go through the process and have time for public input and go through a committee where you have people who specialize in a particular subject, discuss it at length, and then have a vote before it can get to city council, that's sort of the regular way that things occur. But for certain things, either if there's a time sensitivity, for example, or maybe if there isn't kind of the right committee for it to go through, it'll be a special order of business, and then that just kind of appears at the top of the agenda. And that happens specifically because either a majority of city council says so, or because the mayor says so. So all of that is pretty clear and pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, if you go one step further upstream, things start to be, I think, a lot trickier to track. And that was the set of questions that sent me kind of into this journey of trying to understand how things operate and sort of feeling like I was failing to understand how things operate as I was preparing to take office. So we have a number of standing committees, some of them, like the Committee on Administration and Public Works, meets before every single council meeting. A lot of the stuff that winds up on city council agendas starts at the Administration and Public Works Committee. Some of the other significant committees are Planning and Development and Human Services, for example. And so the sort of regular way that a policy change goes into effect is, well, eventually gets passed at city council, but before that, it's got to go through some committee usually. And so the question of what gets on committee agendas and why becomes a super high stakes question. And I'll just tell you, to be a little bit more concrete about this, right now, just at this minute, November 10th, 2021, in the evening, there is more stuff pending than we have time to cover by a wide margin, like way more stuff pending than we have time to cover. So when you're in that situation, the decision of what winds up on the committee agenda is a really significant decision, because there's this giant funnel of ideas coming into the process. And then at some point they got to get on a committee agenda, and there's nowhere near enough room for all of them to do that. And so the decision of which ones do and which ones don't is really important. And that decision, and this is, now we're entering into an area which is both very significant and also the one really significant change that we've made since the new council and I took office. When the committees are preparing to meet, ordinarily there will be a discussion between the committee chair and the staff, who's kind of like a person assigned to support the committee's work, and they would just sort of decide. And the truth of the matter is that the members of council are all really different temperamentally in terms of how they interact with staff and how they see their role as an elected official interacting with the legislative process. So, you'll have some city council members who tend to kind of really take a lot of input from staff, and just, when someone who operates like that is the chair, then staff has an enormous amount of influence over what winds up on the committee agendas. And there are others who are kind of much more, let's say independent and kind of entrepreneurial in how they view their policymaking role. And they might exert much more influence then over what appears on the committee agenda during the period of time they're chair. And during that time, staff might have much less influence. But there's just like some sort of behind the scenes conversation that happens, and then the agenda gets published, and then that's kind of that. And I have to tell you, that worried me when I took office. It worried me because it felt like a process that was pretty opaque. And it worried me because it felt like a process that lacked a certain stability because the committee chairs turn over relatively regularly. You've got these different individuals who see their role really differently, kind of rotating, and it's sort of hard to predict then the variation in how the committees might operate. And like anybody who's taken a new job, my understanding of what came before me is a little impressionistic, but my sense is that this was less of a challenge in the past, at least usually, than it is now, simply because there was just less, there were fewer ideas being put in the hopper by council members. And so you didn't necessarily have the triage problem. It wasn't necessarily the case that there were 10 times as many things that had been proposed as there was time to put stuff on committee agendas. And so even though in theory the process might be kind of alarmingly opaque, most things just sort of move through the process eventually. But now we have a new council, which not only are there 4 new members plus me, and I think in general, those of us who are new just sort of tend to be like, we have our whole life of not having had the authority to introduce items sort of as like pent up demand, right? If you're just reelected, you didn't have a list of things that you were unable to put in the hopper until recently. But for those of us who are new, we had all these new ideas that we ran on that made us want to run in the first place. And also, I just think temperamentally, we've got really, again, kind of entrepreneurial, innovative, and legislatively ambitious folks. And so because of that, there's this different level, I think, of traffic jam than there used to be. And so then let me kind of move back to the beginning of the pipeline. I've sort of alluded to, a council member introducing an idea or putting an idea in the hopper. And the way that this has been done, and again, this sort of relates to the one significant change that we've made so far, is the way that it used to operate is that at the end of every city council meeting, as a kind of special prize for people with the patience to stay until the end of the city council meeting, there's something called Call of the Wards, where every council member one at a time gets called on to kind of say whatever they want to say. And usually it's community announcements. Hey, come to my ward meeting. Hey, congratulations to my constituent who did this awesome thing. Just, kind of announcements like that. But one thing they also had the authority to do is what's called make a referral. And a referral is essentially the introduction of a legislative idea. So a council member would say at Call of the Wards, hey, I want to make a referral to, let's say, the Human Services Committee to consider my ordinance to prohibit crossing the street while wearing a purple shirt. And that act, the physical act of saying the thing into the microphone at 11:30 at night at the end of the meeting was the technical introduction idea, which I have to tell you, for me was a little bit shocking. Because yes, that's a public meeting. Yeah, it's on YouTube, but it's all the things that get said during the course of the Call of the Wards that occurs at the end of each council meeting, week in and week out, and week in and week out. They just sort of go into the ether. And then the expectation the council member has upon saying that is that, well, staff will get to work on thinking about that idea and figuring out what it's going to take for the Human Services Committee to have enough information to consider that that suggestion. And so in the kind of traditional way of doing things, the next step after the council member saying that into that microphone during Call of the Wards would be sort of a quiet period during which maybe there were, in fact, almost certainly there were some behind the scenes conversations going on, but there was no kind of public record of any of this besides the fact that words had been said at a meeting. And then bam, at some point, kind of frankly, some relatively unpredictable point, an agenda item for the Human Services Committee would be a discussion on this or potential ordinance that they would be offered to vote on. And here, if you talk to folks who were on council in the previous term, for instance, they will say, I shouldn't say they will say, different ones of them will say different things. I think there's some who would say, this worked great. I would suggest my idea at Call of the Wards. I would have a phone call with staff. They would figure out what I was trying to accomplish. They would figure out the best way to do it. It would appear on agenda. And then I would have my day in court, so to speak, in front of the committee where we could talk through the idea and hopefully get a vote and get the thing kicked over to council. And others would say, I would make suggestions at Call of the Wards, and then they just sort of wouldn't go anywhere. I wouldn't hear anything, or the item wouldn't appear on agenda, and I didn't know what to do to get it to appear on agenda, and I didn't know why it wasn't appearing on an agenda. And I think even in the previous 4 years, that was a source of frustration for some council members. But in the current environment where there's so much more stuff being referred, there've been north of 50 referrals so far in this council, and I think now that's a sort of dated number. We're probably well past that now. That outcome of, I made the suggestion and then nothing ever came of it, and I couldn't totally tell if it was because nobody heard me or if because it's in line and it's coming, or like maybe the staff member who wants to work on it thinks it's a dumb idea, so they've put it in the back of the line forever, but I just don't even know. There was a lack of transparency, I guess you would say, around the question of how those initial ideas articulated out loud were transformed into words on paper and an agenda item that could then perhaps something for a vote. And that I felt like was a recipe for real trouble, a recipe for bad feelings, a recipe for unjust outcomes, and a recipe for a lot of confusion and potentially tension and unhappiness. And so what we've done is we've created a new committee, which is it's like the saddest thing to say when you're trying to solve a problem about complexity of bureaucracy, is that you're going to create yet another committee, that here we are. We've created a committee whose responsibility is to handle the referrals. So instead of the referrals being made verbally at a city council meeting, they're made in writing, and they're then posted online. So there's a spreadsheet that's publicly viewable that's a list of all the referrals. And then instead of it, they just sort of magically appear on a committee agenda whenever, or maybe they don't. There's a referrals committee, a 3-member committee whose job, and I think it's fair to say, the execution of this idea, which I continue to believe is a really important idea, the execution is a work in progress, where we've made some progress, but there's still some progress left to be made. The job of this committee of 3 people is to essentially help direct traffic and triage things. And so the referral might come in, and the referrals committee might say, oh, this is very clear, very straightforward, and very urgent. Let's send it to the Human Services Committee right now, and hopefully they can put it on their agenda at their next meeting. Or the Referrals Committee might say, this is a huge, complicated project. It's not going to be ready for a committee hearing until staff has done a bunch of legwork and done a lot of research and prepared a detailed memo. Let's work with staff to get that stuff ready, figure out the timeline on which we can do it, at which point we'll then assign this to the committee so that that hearing can occur. And the idea is to make sure that the mechanism by which we take the more ideas than we have time for and turn it into the stuff that appears on agendas is totally transparent and is done with a knowledge of all the different ideas at play, so that there are less haphazard decisions and hopefully more efficient decisions. And I think if this thing ultimately is working properly, there will be a much higher degree of certainty that council members and advocates in the community understand if something's going to be on the agenda soon, if not, why, and what it's going to take to get it on the agenda. And I think that's a tool that's going to be very, very valuable for people who are just trying to navigate the process and enact policies they care about. The last thing I want to say about this is that historically, and again, we're in the process of changing this. Historically, a referral wasn't an idea for a public policy change. It was an idea for a public policy change initiated by a council member. But lots of the stuff that appeared on city council, on committee agendas wasn't a referral. It might just be initiated by staff. And so then you had this kind of tension that arose where some council members would say, I mean, I was elected to represent my community and I've got this idea I'm trying to push. And in the meantime, the ideas that are advocated by staff can wind up ahead of my idea in line. Why is that? And one thing, so the other thing that we're trying to do is put all public policy changes in the same category so that there's not a fast lane for staff. There's not a fast lane for a particular elected official or a particular office. It's just all these ideas are put in a single process. The process is transparent, it's done in public, and therefore we have the best shot of making decisions about how to allocate scarce time in a way that's really consistent with what the community is trying to achieve. So I feel like I've been talking for a very long time, and it's been, sort of as promised, it's been technical and dry. And so I thought I might pause. I see there's been a lot of action on the chat, which I've not been able to read because I'm terrified of, losing my grammar halfway through a sentence because I'm trying to read while talking. But I don't know if now's a good time, Diane and Rick, to.
Yeah, the stuff in the chat has been mostly links to things that you've been talking about, like the referral tracker, but there are two questions. So how do council members submit referrals now since it's not in the call of the wards phase? That's the first question.
So that's simple. There's a web form they utilize. So they're still welcome to, and I would even probably encourage them to talk about it in call of the wards because that, there's an extra opportunity to share it with the community. But the benefit of doing it this way is it then feeds into this tracker that was shared, which is online and doesn't go anywhere. And so I think it's more transparent to do just the tracker than to have just the call of the wards. But I've encouraged folks, just it's worth doing both just to make sure that there's as many avenues as possible to keep the public informed.
So do staff members, this is my question, do staff members need to fill that out as well?
Well, Diane, we're trying to effectuate culture change here. Historically, that's nothing like that has been the case. And what we're trying to say here is just to make sure that nobody feels like there's some potential of, like I said, a fast lane for staff ideas that results in council members' ideas being kind of behind them in the queue, which obviously would be a bad outcome. And so because of that, we've actually officially changed the rule. So the rule now says that the rule doesn't talk about referrals coming from council members. It says public policy changes. So it doesn't matter who the public policy change comes from, it's got to go through the referrals committee. And that, I think, I don't want to for a second pretend that we are complying with that rule yet. In fact, for those of you who saw the council meeting this past Monday evening, Councilmember Reed accurately pointed out that the council agenda from this past Monday evening was inconsistent with that rule. And he and everyone else was like, we got why, but he said, let's at least vote to suspend the rules so we're not just violating a rule without even acknowledging it. But the end state that we are shooting for is one where all public policy changes wind up in the same bucket so they can be considered in a fair and transparent way. Now, let me be very clear about one thing, which is totally unclear, which is that not everything that appears on an agenda is a public policy change. And again, for those of you who watch our meetings, there's a lot of voting for to pay our bills, voting to enter into a contract with a particular asphalt company, a lot of just mechanical operation of government. And the idea is not for those to go through the referrals committee. Those, the basic idea here, which you alluded to the question, Diane, in your introduction about, about how this form of government really works. The idea here is to respect the division of labor that's contemplated in our form of government, where the policy direction and the vision comes from the elected officials, and the management and the execution comes from the staff. And the truth of the matter is that we vote on a lot of things that are related to management and execution because we have oversight authority over the spending of money, as we should. So I always say we too, which is this kind of funny kind of, I'm promoting myself. Like I don't vote on anything. I just sit up there with a gavel and tell other people when they can vote. So forgive the slightly grandiose pronoun there.
The royal we.
Yeah, right, exactly. But yeah, so the idea is, and this is not a clean, bright line, which is where things get tricky. But the idea is to say, there's lots of stuff that council votes on and the committees vote on that is about the operation of government, and that should not go to the referrals committee or be viewed as kind of apples to apples with a change in public policy or a setting of the vision and direction of the city. But for the things that are changes in public policy, setting of direction for the vision of the city, there ought to be a single process that is utilized by everybody.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, can you speak to procedures and techniques of bringing together the various interests and factions regarding an issue, especially when it is Joe citizen and high power groups with lobbyists?
Well, the one thing I'll say is, I mean, politically speaking, I come from Springfield. And so it has been a delight in city council, just how few lobbyists, I mean, there's no lobbyists really and we don't have a lobbyist ordinance, but there's very, like, almost nobody is paid to come to city council and effectuate an outcome, which is great. I mean, really a really welcome breath of fresh air. And so that's a big help for just kind of residents who are trying to effectuate change. You might often be up against a lot, but you're rarely up against a professional whose job is to manipulate the city council. Whereas, if you're trying to effectuate change in Springfield or Washington, you are literally always up against a paid professional whose job is to manipulate those bodies. So that's just a kind of useful piece of context. I think that resident groups and just interested residents in Evanston are extremely effective at getting the attention of elected officials. And I think that's partially because residents are organized and do their work well, which is great. It's also because council members are pretty accessible, which is also great. And so I don't think it's very difficult if you have a thing that you want to see happen, or if you have a specific change that you would like to see made, or a specific ordinance you'd like to see passed. I don't think it's hard to get council to be aware of that. What I think might be helpful for advocacy groups who are trying to effectuate change is what I would view as kind of the next phase after the raising of awareness, which is really the kind of tactics and vote counting. Who is your champion internally? If you look at the controversial, difficult things that have passed on city council, very often it's because there's one council member who's really, really, really deeply committed to it and is relentlessly working with outside advocates to persuade their colleagues. And so, one artifact of the process the legislative process we have here that has been very foreign to me as someone who's used to Springfield, but I don't know if it's good or bad, it's just different, is we don't have bill sponsors, right? It's not, an ordinance is not introduced by council member X. It's just an ordinance that's up for a vote. So if you're an advocate in Springfield, you want someone to pass a bill, your first job is to find a sponsor. And you identify that sponsor, and that's a tactical decision based upon who will be best positioned to help you pass the bill. And then you work hand in glove with them to get your votes. That is not a part of our procedure here in the Evanston City Council, but there's no reason that it can't be a part of the bag of tricks of an advocacy group. And so if I were trying to pass a bill, or an ordinance or a resolution, or just make a policy change, my first step would be to figure out not who are my 5 supporters, but who is my one champion who is gonna, eat and sleep and breathe this, who's gonna wake up in the morning trying to think about how to pass my thing, who's gonna fail to fall asleep at night because they're gonna be up kind of thinking about how to pass my thing. And then once you identify that person, the extraordinary beauty, and I say this again as a guy who's used to Springfield, where I had to count to 30 all the time as a senator and 60 as a rep, the beauty of Springfield is you only got to count to 5. Of the city councils, you only got to count to 5. And so, once you have an idea that's that you have a real champion who's willing to make it a serious part of their agenda and really spend time and effort on it, work with that person to figure out how to find 5 votes. And I think there's been quite a few instances, just to be real direct among friends, there's been quite a few instances just in the 6 months. Oh, hey, this is the 6-month anniversary. In fact, 6 months ago right now, we were at City Hall being sworn in. I hadn't thought about that, but it's a good hook for this event. In these 6 months that we've had this new council, I think there have been several incidents where advocates have said, to me even, have said, I thought Councilmember X was with me, and then it turns out they weren't. And look, obviously, people can change their minds. People, I wouldn't expect our council to do that, but people hypothetically could even just lie to make someone feel better. But I think there is something to be said for making extremely hard and precise asks, for sort of understanding really meticulously the difference between, hey, do you believe in this idea? And can I count on you to vote yes when this thing comes up for consideration tomorrow? Right. And so I think those to me are the 3 steps, are the 3 hard steps that go after the raising awareness and making the argument is, number 1, find your champion. Number 2, figure out who your 5 votes are. And if you can find 6 or 7, that definitely wouldn't hurt. And then number 3, get your firm, rock solid commitments so that they're not 5 probablys, they're 5 absolutely's.
So Mayor Biss, I know there's a lot of questions in the chat, but it sounds like the city council is all powerful. And that's where, advocacy has to happen at that city council level of driving, decision-making. It sounds to me.
Well, I would say that part of what's a little bit nuanced, and I think really important to get our heads around in this form of government, is there are areas where council is all powerful, and there's areas where council is, ultimately on some technical level, council is really all powerful because to the extent they don't have power, the city manager has power, and they can always just fire the city manager. But that's a kind of a really extreme way to think about it. Practically speaking, there's areas where the council is really all powerful, and there's areas where staff, with the city manager at the top of the org chart, are all powerful. And so if you're trying to get, to give an example of something we're working on right now, if you're trying to make beach access free, that's city council. That's a public policy change. The beaches are administered by the Parks and Recreation and Community Services Department, but that's not a decision for them to make. And so putting pressure on them about that is just not going to be effective. But when it comes to other items, any personnel item other than who the city manager is, for example, but also how programs are run and operated, the council's opinion matters, and they weigh in, and I weigh in as well. But staff are meant to be insulated from political influence. And so there's certain types of decisions, especially about the operation and management of city government, where persuading staff is more important than persuading council, and staff really is all powerful on those managerial operational issues.
Rick, was that it, Rick? Can you finish the answer? Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
There's another question in the chat, and I bet you'll be able to tell who this comes from. So it sounds like right now, the only way for ordinances to happen is to go directly through city council. Around the country, many municipalities have a voter initiative process, which have led to increasing the minimum wage, legalization of cannabis, universal early childhood education, and other good stuff. How could Evanston have a voter initiative process so we can have good stuff that starts with us and gives a mechanism for the will of the people to be the law of the land? And there's also a little happy anniversary.
I mean, I feel like it had to be Ali Harned because of who's in this particular meeting, but she was doing her absolute best top shelf Pat Quinn, and it was well done, very well done. Even before the Pat Quinn signature sign off of the will of the people being the law of the land, it was already an excellent Pat Quinn. So as some of you may know, there's interest in creating a voter initiative process in Evanston. So in Evanston, I believe without exception, there's no binding policy change that can be enacted just by residents getting signatures and the signatures putting it on the ballot and the thing passing. There can be non-binding referenda all the time, which many of you know very well have been very, very effective. They made a big difference, but there are not binding referenda. And so there's an interest on the part of some people in having that occur. And the way it would have to happen is the city council would have to pass a resolution creating a referendum. This is the most amazing conversation ever. We would be creating a referendum about referenda. And so it would go to the people in an election. And then if that referendum passed, then we would have this new system in place where in the future, residents could get signatures and put something on the ballot, and through whatever process was laid out in the resolution, eventually have it become law. There was actually a hearing about this in the Rules Committee probably about a month ago, I want to say, where both Ali and Governor Quinn were there to present. I would say it got kind of a lukewarm reception. I think there are some people, one council member said, "Hey, I'm from California, and I saw how voter initiatives broke California public schools for a long period of time, and I'm not comfortable with it." And there were a few others who had comments like that just said, philosophically, I don't think this is the right way to go. But I think there are plenty of people, and I would count myself in this category, who like the idea, thinks it's an attractive idea, but sort of had a lot of questions like, how do we do it right? What's the best way to do it? What's the way to do it that will avoid unintended negative consequences, the way that will empower residents in the most efficacious and responsible way? And I think that those questions haven't really been resolved yet, and so I think that conversation is still very much in our present and future.
There's a couple of comments in the chat that I don't know are questions, but one person said there are a handful of things that Article 7 of Illinois Constitution does allow binding referenda for.
Things like
You're
change
absolutely
in
right.
government, this would be a change in how we govern. So that's why it would be. Well, that was actually the debate in the courts about that. But we could have term limits or recall by referenda.
Right, and thank you very much, Abigail. I'm really sorry. You're absolutely right. So I guess what I should have said is that beyond what's guaranteed in the Illinois Constitution, Evanston hasn't chosen any other additional referendum options for residents. So Evanston residents have the same thing every single Illinois resident has in terms of what you can initiate by petition to get a referendum on the ballot and make a policy change. But there's some places, like I think Arlington Heights, for example, that have more opportunities for residents to make changes via petition and referendum. And the question is, should we do that here? And if so, how?
Okay, there aren't any more questions in the chat. I don't want to dominate, but since I was, the one who wanted to do this, I have a lot of questions, but I would like other people if they, I don't want to, you know, dominate here. Oh, here we go. A couple more. Can Evanston pass laws in conflict with state law as home rule? That is a question.
I agree with Larry, by the way. It's your meeting, Diane. You're the chair's prerogative. So this is one of those your mayor's not a lawyer moments. So let me see how I do here. In the 1970 Constitution, or the current Constitution, but not the version that existed before 1970, Illinois municipalities can have home rule authority. So some municipal governments are home rule governments and some are not. And home rule governments have quite a lot more power and flexibility. I think there's a population floor where once you go above that population floor, you sort of by default are home rule unless you opt out. So like Rockford is not home rule, but it's highly unusual. Almost every city, Evanston size, and even almost every community quite a bit smaller is also home rule. And then certain counties are home rule. And I believe no other units of local government. So one, probably the most newsworthy example of the difference between home rule and not home rule is you might notice that sometimes we have property tax increase referenda for our school districts, but we never have that for the city. And the reason is that the city can increase property taxes to whatever level the city council members want, pretty much. And there's a law that was passed on the state level that basically says that if you're not a home rule community, you operate under what's called a tax cap, which means you can only increase your property tax levy by the rate of inflation every year. And so every year the city council can set a property tax levy of whatever it wants to set, whereas pretty much every year the school boards raise the property tax levy by the amount of inflation. And then if they ever want to go beyond that, that's when these referenda occur. But that's just kind of a template for the broader fact that it's much harder for the state to constrain home rule communities. And so in Springfield, when the state wants to pass a law that what they call preempts home rule, that limits what a home rule municipality can do, that law has to pass with a supermajority. And so with a supermajority, with a 3/5 vote in the House and a 3/5 vote in the Senate, the state absolutely can control what home rule municipalities do. But without that, they cannot. And so when a bill is up for a vote in Springfield, the parliamentarian has to make a ruling. Does this preempt home rule or not? And if the parliamentarian rules that it does preempt home rule, it can't pass without a 3/5 majority. And so sometimes laws pass with that 3/5 majority and the home rule power of the municipality is taken away. Other times they don't pass with that majority, but the bill is amended to say it only applies to non-home rule communities. So the practical answer is it varies. But in general, we don't get to just break the law because we're a home rule community, but we have protections against inflexibility being foisted upon us by the state. And then in practice, that winds up meaning there's various things that we can do that other communities can't. So like one example, if I recall correctly, and I'm of course glad we didn't use our home rule authority on this, but if I recall correctly, when Cook County increased its minimum wage and a bunch of municipalities were opting out, I think only the home rule municipalities were allowed to opt out. And so I think non-home rule communities were sort of forced to operate under the Cook County minimum wage, and home rule communities could opt out. And unfortunately, almost all of them did, though again, I'm very glad to say Evanston did not, which is, an example of how it cuts both ways. Obviously, as a mayor of a municipality, I want to retain as much authority for municipality as possible. But, here's an example. There was a law that was passed in Springfield this past spring that says that every municipality has to replace all of their lead service lines in the next 35 years. That's an expensive mandate that was imposed on municipalities And, a lot of mayors said, don't make us do this expensive thing. And my attitude was, it's the right thing. It's morally correct. It's necessary. And we're going to go out and find the money to do it, hopefully with a lot of help from the federal government. But there are times, even if it may be inconvenient, where it's, I think, just and frankly morally important for mandates to be imposed on all municipalities.
Okay, thank you for that. There is another question. What do you think about public comment? Does it make a difference, and how could people do it better? I think the question broadly is, how do we as advocates and citizens maximize or have more influence over the process?
So I think many of you have heard me. I'm sort of a well-known kind of public comment skeptic, I think it's fair to say. And the sort of frame I bring to this is very simple. We don't do public comment because we sat around in the city council chamber and decided the best way to get public input was to have anybody who wants to come give a speech that is 45 minutes divided by the number of people who happen to show up that night and not get a response. That wasn't some brilliant idea that we had and we all high-fived each other and said, we've got it. This was mandated by the state, not the 45-minute part, but the state mandates that all local governments have public comment as a tool to give the public the ability to have their voices heard. And I think we make a catastrophic mistake if we act as though just because the state said we have to do it, that means it's the best way for people to have their voices heard. And so I would say respectfully that I think a lot of people sort of overweight the benefit that can be achieved by participating in public comment, which is fine to do. I think it's positive. I think there is benefit to the council and the community and having that opportunity for anybody to walk up to the mic and share their thoughts. But people sometimes complain that it's not a dialogue. It's not a dialogue for a practical reason, which is that it would be really, really problematic for it to be a dialogue only when council feels like responding and not a dialogue the rest of the time. But if the law says that everybody who wants to come to the mic gets to come to the mic, you can't have it be a dialogue with all of them, because if there's 40 people who sign up, as sometimes happens, and we have 40 dialogues, the council meeting is going to start at 2 a.m. And I'm a night owl. I'm not one of these people who's sad about still being up, but I don't think the work product that the city gets from its council is optimized if they start doing their work at the back end of a 5-hour public sort of town hall style discourse. And so I would say for public comment itself, I think things that are really helpful are, first of all, variation, right? I don't mean to call people out, but I guess I will. Allie was part of a group of mental health professionals and advocates who organized a series of 5 interrelated pieces of commentary they went right back to back. They addressed a really important issue. The messengers were credible. I think that was a really, really smart way of approaching it. I think making a direct and clear point is important. I think the whole setup is kind of frustrating and annoying for everybody, right? And so if you come to the mic frustrated, as I would not blame anyone for doing, because you sort of want to have a discussion, instead you're like talking to the wall, there's a temptation to sort of spend a minute or two talking about how frustrating that thing is. And then not only have you chewed up a bunch of your time, but you've also sort of I think a lot of your audience, to the extent that council's your audience, is kind of switched off at that point because they've heard that before. And so I think coming in with a crisp and novel point is really valuable. And again, I'm not saying that it's worthless, because it's clear. I mean, you've got council there, they're listening. I know there's several council members who take notes on every single person who gives public comment. Obviously I'm paying attention. I'm directing traffic a little bit, and so I can't always like focus on the detail of the cars, but I'm definitely paying attention. And so it's really good for just getting an idea in front of folks. And that's part of why I said earlier, I think activists and advocates in this town are great at getting their idea to the point of awareness. But I wouldn't ever make that the beginning and end of my advocacy. And I wouldn't even honestly, just to be frank, make it the number one focal point of my advocacy. I think, I think one-on-one meetings with council members, or one on several, right, where you bring a group of advocates and experts to educate a council member about something, it's really important. I think, again, finding that one champion who you can really work with regularly. And, and again, I'm not a council member now, but when I was in the legislature, if I was working closely with you on your project and it was really something that I was engaged in and really focused on, we talked on the phone every day. We were texting constantly. I mean, I was like your puppet almost, like in the Senate chamber, working hand in glove with you to achieve an objective. And I think building those kinds of relationships with council members could be really beneficial.
Okay, thank you. Did that answer, Ellie? Is that good?
I actually I was
One
just
follow-up.
typing in the chat to follow up with what you just said, Daniel. You said to bring a group of advocates together and have a one-on-one meeting with a council member. Is there what is the limit about how many elected officials can be in the same space to not break
Great
OMA?
question. So the Open Meetings Act, which governs every, what they're called, the term of art is public body. So it not only governs city council, it governs every committee, it governs all kinds of different entities that we don't necessarily think about very often. But what it says is that a majority of a quorum cannot have a meeting unless the meeting is like a public meeting with an agenda that's posted 48 hours in advance and public comment and all that stuff. So for city council, for some reason that I don't fully understand, I count. So even though there's 9 members, I'm part of the quorum. So a quorum of the 10 of us is 6. A majority of 6 is 4. This is the math teacher part of the evening's program. And so 4 of us can't be in a room together. So you cannot meet with 4 city council members or 3 city council members and me. But you can meet with 3 city council members or 2 city council members and me. And I think, there's, obviously I'm not trying to give people extra homework, but to the extent that you're able to devote time, I think there's benefit in meeting with them one at a time also. So I was saying I was thinking of a group of advocates, like for example, Allie, that group of mental health advocates kind of as follow-up conversations, you could imagine meeting one at a time with some of the council members, particularly if there's a specific ask that they wanted to advance.
Okay, here's a really interesting question. Mayor Biss, do you sometimes feel convicted to establish a moral position in opposition to an ordinance or effort that you disagree with, but you remain somewhat neutral for the maintenance of good working relationships? Or do you allow the perception of the community to guide your input and or decision making? It's a good one.
So
That's a good one.
It's a great one. It's somehow the fundamental question of public service, right? Like it's all in that question.
Totally,
honestly.
totally is.
So first of all, I'll start with a narrow answer and I'll try to broaden out. I mean, narrowly, I'm up there presiding over these meetings. And I feel like I have a responsibility, like my actual job description is be a neutral chair of the meeting. Which is not always my instinct. But I think I've done a pretty good job of doing that. I mean, there was one time when I was a little bit shocked about the outcome of a vote, and I think I let it show a little bit. But I do, there was an interesting back and forth in council this past Monday evening where one council member kind of, I think pretty frustrated, accused me of, kind of putting my thumb on the scale. And And it's interesting, the thing that I was allegedly putting up my thumb on the scale for had almost no support anyway. It went down on an 8-1 vote. I wasn't putting my thumb on the scale for it. I didn't, that wasn't what I was doing at all. But also, even if I'd wanted to, I would have known that that wasn't the time to weigh in. But I do think that as a chair of the meeting, I do state my opinion sometimes. I try to be really cautious about when, because I don't want to interject myself too much. But I feel like, every member of that city council is elected by their ward to represent their ward, and I've got to treat them all equally in that context up there. But of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg of that question, right? How do you weigh your own values and conscience against the will of the public? How do you measure the will of the public? Who is the will of the public? So part of how do you measure the will of the public is a technical question, right? Like, how do you know what people think? But part of it is not a technical question. Part of it is, how do you weight people? Do you weight, right? If you hold a referendum, everybody gets one yes vote or one no vote, or they get to not show up. But if you have an informal meeting with a group of people, usually the people who care the most wind up having their voices heard the most, right? So how do you weigh a situation where maybe in a referendum something would pass 55-45, and maybe the 45 are really passionate about it, really care deeply about it, and the 55 are just kind of meh. So I don't have any formulas to answer any of this stuff. I think all of this has to be judgment, a series of judgment calls. But I think it's important to erect some tests to make sure that you're holding yourself to some standards. So one standard that I try to hold myself to is, am I willing to have my opinion changed by advocates? Right. So I think that's really, really important, that if you're not willing to learn something and change your mind, then all of advocacy becomes a charade, right? And it's not really advocacy at all. It's just a series of performances with a predetermined outcome. And so I try very, very hard to make sure that I understand what it would take to get me to change my mind, and that I always maintain enough of an open mind to be willing, if new information comes in, to change my mind. That's one part of it. Another part of it is to understand what my core values are and make sure I'm sticking to them. Right? I mean, I think there's actually nothing wrong with, in fact, I think it's even really good and beautiful for, in a democracy, compromise to happen, and for people to agree to things that wouldn't have been their first choice in service of a different objective they're really passionate about, or in an effort to compromise some of what they believe in to achieve consensus and allow the government to move forward more effectively. I think all that is, it's not just sort of like a icky thing you got to live with because like that's the gross thing, the gross reality of politics, but actually that's democracy working well. But it only works well if you remember what the core values are and you're not prepared to compromise them. And so that's another test that I try to subject myself to as consistently and rigorously as possible. And then the other question that I like to ask is, am I on a team? Because like CABG, I love you. And I love what you're doing. And I love why you're doing it. By the way, you endorsed me in the campaign. So I could just sort of be on your team and say, like, I'm the CABG guy, and I'm going to do what they say, sight unseen. If they say the sky is blue, I say the sky is blue. And when they say the sky is orange, I say the sky is orange. And I just try to make sure I'm not doing that ever. That no matter how much I may have a positive predisposition about a person or an organization, or maybe no matter how much I might have a negative predisposition, I'm never gonna judge the issue based on who it's coming from. I mean, obviously there's people I trust a lot, and the fact that I trust them matters, but I still have to be willing, no matter how much I trust you, to sometimes disagree with you and to live with and accept that discomfort if I think it's the right thing for the city or the right thing for my core values.
And that's fair. And that's really all we can ask.
Yeah.
I mean, the bottom line here is we're trying to, make a difference in our community, and we appreciate that comment. Diane or Ally, here we are at the 8:13. We will end up at 8:30.
I think
But,
there's
here-
one person, I'm sorry, I think there's one person who wanted to ask a question.
Okay, all right.
One more about reforming elections in Evanston. Is there somebody who wanted to ask that? You can unmute and speak up since it's not in the chat.
You can guess who.
Anyone?
Oh, did he vanish?
Not to put anybody on the spot, but
I can ask his question and then answer it if you want.
Diane, hi, this is Betty. I did want to ask the question and it had nothing.
Oh, what just happened?
Was she trying to ask a question? I thought she said Diane, but now was she saying Daniel?
No, well, Betty is
I think
is,
she wanted to ask a question.
muted.
It sounded like she was on the phone, and so I was like, mute. Sorry,
No,
Betty, sorry.
I think
Betty
she
was
wants to
asking
ask
a
a
question?
question.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Go ahead. Did
I'm
you?
asking her to unmute. She might not know that she's muted. Betty, can you unmute yourself? So sorry. That sounded like one of those
Right. That's
catching
okay.
a phone call during a Zoom.
There we go.
Oh, there she
Here we
is.
go. Sorry, Betty, my bad.
No, that's okay.
Can you start your question over? I thought you were like answering a phone call. I'm really sorry.
No, because Diane wanted to ask the question, was somebody wanted to ask about the election process. And I just merely said to Diane, no, I do not have a question about the election process, but I do have a question I would like to ask. And it's in reference to the referral committee and how things are brought to the referral committee. And you have to, it kind of goes to staff and they looks at it, if I'm hearing you correctly, and then they bring it to the committee and they discuss it. That process, taking things to the referral committee with the staff, it's not working for the people that you classify as marginalized people. Because there has been numbers of things that we have brought to the city and stuff, and it just passes on and don't get anything done and are even addressed. And then maybe 10 or 6 months later, the staff might happen to think, oh, we need to do this, and we will put it to come forth this way and not take up what the group brought to them and how they want to work and to change something that is affecting them the most. And for instance, the new police commission that reviews the complaints and everything. We came to the city to talk about that and to work with that. No marginalized people really work with that, and to say that people that knew things about it, that was living it, their voices didn't get heard. So that referral committee, with having it to go to the staff, I think is the wrong thing, because your staff, most of them don't live here in Evanston, and their opinion and stuff of the people that lives here and what they do is sometimes kind of condescending, and we wind up with at the short end of the stick. And we can look at that and see the number of times the people that have came and said, hey, we need help. We here doing this, and the affordable houses and the people that come and speak to the council, like Carlos and Tina, and who speaks for all of the other Black landlords, the small landlords that's here. And they get pushed down. They don't even say, let's sit down at a table and see what is it that we can do. We don't get that invitation. So if you can, if this can happen where we can make an ordinance, put an ordinance on the book, that would be good, because then the marginalized people would be heard, because then that process would be there for them. Right now, we fight in an uphill battle and getting nothing. And you talk about affordable housing. You have apartments that they rent that is affordable. You have an ADU unit that was set up in the 1900 block of Jackson. And they built this, and it was what was so surprising. It was built by one of the city chodos, and they're renting the house, a 1-bedroom, for $2,000. And how is that supposed to be affordable? How is that going to affect the people that stays in the building in front of them, who all are low incomes and
Hi, Betty. Sorry, I hate to cut you off, but I want to give Daniel a chance to answer, and also we want to kind of wrap up the meeting pretty soon. So I think he's got the basic idea of what your question is. So Mayor Biss, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I mean, thank you, Ms. Esther. And it was a question with a lot in it. And I think to me, there's a few different components. Part of what the Referrals Committee is supposed to do is to actually, not that we don't rely on staff to do staff work, of course, but to have the decision about what gets heard when not be made in private by staff, but instead get made in public, on the record, transparently by elected officials. I'll be the first to concede that we're not all the way there yet in terms of the system being up and running to the level of smoothness, let's say, that we want to get to. But the whole point here is to have the decisions of what gets heard when not get made in secret by folks who aren't elected, but instead to be made in public by folks who are. But I think the other part of what you're saying is really well taken, which is that if a council member or a staff member has an idea for a change they want to make, they've got a process that they can go through to try to pass an ordinance. And if a community group or a resident does, they have to, right now, as Rick said earlier, work through their council member. And so I think that brings us back to the point that was raised earlier by Allie of there are folks in this community who would like to see a petition referendum process so that ideas that come up from the community and have not been initiated by a council member can still come up for a vote. So I think your point's really, really well taken, and there's definitely progress to be made on all aspects of what you're discussing.
Okay.
So with that being said, I mean, here we are. I mean, this has been a great session. I mean, here we are on a Wednesday night in November, talking about some of the, I mean, we could look at it as being mundane, foundational kind of stuff of, government, but this is the stuff that really makes a difference in, how our cities, how our government is managed. And I just can't thank everyone enough for spending the time with us for an hour and a half on a Wednesday night, again in November, with our mayor. And Mayor Biss, I so appreciate you, spending this time with us and kind of sharing, these kind of insights. And it's just extremely helpful. I mean, again, as a Community Alliance for Better Government, our focus is to increase the number of engaged residents, around community advocacy. We want to build our Community Alliance for Better Government. We need more human capital and more volunteers to be a part of our organization. We do have regular CBG meetings. We do email. We have newsletters, and we're working on a podcast. And we want to have a scorecard, metrics on elected officials, like a vote tracker. We want to develop relationships at the senior levels of Evanston government, as we talked about tonight. Equity, transparency, inclusion, is our focus. So what I heard tonight is important that, I come from a corporate background, throughout my whole, business work career. And I know that it's called in-depth selling, where you got to sell at all levels of an organization. You got to sell in the C-suite, with the mayor who we have here, and you got to sell it all through staff. And you got to kind of build your organization and develop the relationships to have the influence to make a difference and driving it. We have to define committees and committee leadership. We need folks on committees. We need board committee work and support. And we're trying to build all of that as a relatively new organization, with our Community Alliance for Better Government. We're trying to make a difference. We're not trying to be, negative or detrimental. We want our community of Evanston to be the best that it can be. And we're trying to do it based on involvement and advocacy and education, to make us to be the best that we can be. And how do we define what issues to focus on as a Community Alliance for Better Government? And that's kind of who we are. So folks that came on tonight, I saw a lot of, new names on here that I was not familiar with. Please join us. Again, I mean, we're here to try to make our community better. And Allie, what can we do? How do we connect with folks from this call here tonight?
Thanks for asking. I've been putting in the chat a Google form. If you could fill it out so that we can have your email address and add you to our email list, and you get to sign up for committees. We have a communications committee and an education committee that puts on events like this. Oh my God, what are the other committees? Communications.
Wards.
Thank you. Jeez.
Board group committee. I was just trying to unmute and tell you that. Yeah.
You know, and then, but then I was trying to think of the word for when we support a candidate. Referral. No, it's not that. We did it before the election.
Endorse.
That's the
Endorse.
word. Oh my gosh, my brain is tired.
How can I forget that word?
Yes, an endorsement committee we'll have when elections come around again. And I was just going to say, I was just about to put in the chat, we'll stop the recording. If you want to stay on and ask any questions about CABG, board members will be on for a little bit, but I don't want to be the last speaker, so we should probably.
Well, I think you got one thing, Alan. Saturday.
Yes, oh, we're having a meeting on Saturday at 10 a.m. I've been putting that in the chat over and over. So please, please come to that meeting. And Mayor Biss, did you want to give?
Well, before we get to Mayor Biss, to kind of finalize this, again, Diane, you and Mayor Biss, you guys worked in concert to bring this together. And again, I've been living in Evanston for 37 years. I've never been involved in something like this. We have our mayor being involved in helping us from an educational standpoint.
You want the computer?
And so this is pretty special. So Diane, I'll let you end it here with your connection here with Mayor Biss and how this all came about, and just say thank you again.
It wasn't hard. I just asked Mayor Biss, and he's more than willing to connect with people. Very accessible mayor. So I really appreciate it. I just also wanted to say one thing, wanted to kind of introduce the CABG leadership team that's on the call. There's a couple of people who are not on the call, but Rick, myself, Bennett Johnson, Nick Gorzanowski, Ellie Harned, and Leslie Williams, who has her camera off, and also Sebastian Knowles and Gail Schechter. And am I forgetting anybody? Oh, Oliver. Where is he?
Oliver.
Oliver Ruff. Yes, how could I forget Oliver? He signed up 4 times for this. So, yeah, and I thank everybody for coming. It was a really pleasant surprise to see a lot of people, a lot of new names, and I just hope we continue to see you in the
Mayor
future in our
Biss,
meetings.
you have the last word.
Well, I just wanted to thank everybody. I mean, by the way, there's 26 people still on this call, but there were 29 people about 5 minutes ago, which is, I think
36
the peak
earlier.
attendance was 30. So, I mean, it
It
is.
was 36.
Oh, really?
36 was peak attendance, yes.
All right. Well, shows what I know.
I was watching.
I apologize. I got distracted. You know, the sound of my own voice, apparently. In any case, it was still, I mean, it's a real testament that folks wanted to engage in a conversation like this for an hour and a half. I mean, I know I was sounding kind of tongue in cheek, but I wasn't. I love the work that y'all do at CAPG. I love the commitment to grassroots advocacy. And I love this kind of conversation because I do think that knowledge is power, and these systems are deliberately complicated and deliberately opaque to make it harder for ordinary people to have an impact. And whatever I can do to help kind of pull back the curtain and empower people with the tools to effectuate the change that they believe in, I'm totally committed to. So I was tickled by the invitation. Like I said, I've been delighted by the level of the discussion and just the number of people who are willing to stick it out for an hour and a half. And whatever else I can do that's helpful in this direction, count me in.
Thank
That's
you.
pretty cool to have a mayor like this, I must say.
Well,
So,
appreciate it.
Emerson. All right, so
Thanks so much.
That
And to be
ends-
clear, if Mayor Biss is excused, I said, if anybody wants to talk to the CABG leadership, you may stay on and ask questions. Sorry. Go ahead, Rick.
Right, guys. Thank you so much. I
Hi,
appreciate it.
Danielle.
All right, Rick, wrap it up.
met our time commitment, and you know, we're good. So
All right, great. 10 a.m. Saturday is our meeting. I will stop the recording now. Thanks, everyone.